This very damaged VHS tape that has been converted to DVD was made April 27th in 2000. This is an interview with well-known Hudson residents and also Lenore resident Dr. Harry Hickman and Gordon Bush, who was a police officer way back in Lenore's history.
I'm Nell Greene. We're gathered today in the hall of Mississippi Query to recall Hudson the way it was. Some of our most distinguished citizens are gathered here, and they remember Hudson the way it was better than you and I do. But before we take that trip down memory lane, let's go around and introduce each of our distinguished panelists. This is Barbara Crump, who has lived in Hudson most of her life. Next to her is Johnson Coffey, who is also a Hudson native. Seated next to her is Eunice Query, who is a distinguished retired librarian and a prominent member of the community. Next to her is Blanche Fox, who is perhaps one of the best gardeners in Hudson. Next to Blanche is Gordon Bush, who grew up in Hudson and has a lot of memories of growing up here, playing ball and other things. And next to Gordon is Dr. Harry Hickman, who also grew up in Hudson. Now we'll begin hearing from each of you folks, and if you will just take some time to tell us your memories of Hudson. We'll start with Eunice.
Okay, just hold a minute.
Nell wants to know how old I am, but I have already put some of this on audio tape, and I have discovered that my life parallels that of the town pretty well. Also, the Hudson cotton mill parallels the life of the town pretty well. The town started about 100 years ago, and I came along just a few years after that, and the cotton mill started about the same time that the town did. And that's the reason my father came to Hudson, was to work with the cotton mill. Now, what I want to say is that there isn't much left of the cotton mill. I don't know whether there's much left of me or not, but I've been called Grandma twice this week, so that you can tell from that. I was also interested in the place of this sort of thing in history, and I've discovered two terms I think you might be interested in, and one is absorbed memory. I think science says, Carrie can correct me if I'm wrong, that the human being does not remember actually much that happened to him before he was 4 years old. He may think he does, but it's absorbed memory that he gets from his elders recalling things about him. But that is supposed to be reliable also. And another type of memory is collective memory, and we represent that. The Hudson Cotton Manufacturing Company started in 1904. I don't know how long it took to build the mill, but Mr. Hayes was the superintendent, and my father was one of the overseers, as they call it now. He came from, and I guess I'm the only foreigner in this group, but my father and mother came from Gaston and Lincoln counties to work up here. Now, I never have understood just why Mr. Hayes preferred to go to the mountains to get the hands to work in the mill. I remember Papa telling about making several trips there to get hands. They always looked for families that had a lot of children, especially girls, because the work in the cotton mill was done primarily by women, and sometimes by girls as young as 8 and 9 years old, because they didn't have child labor laws then. And because they brought people in, there were no houses for them, and they had to build houses. So the street that now runs parallel with Mount Herman Road down to Redwood Park, the cotton mill built houses on both sides of the street. There were 3-room houses, 4-room houses, 6-room houses, and people were assigned to them according to the size of the families. And every family had a garden plot, and they sometimes had collective gardening. For instance, they would hire a farmer to plow all the lots, and much of what we ate came from those gardens. Children helped plant them, helped tend them, helped reap the harvest. The houses were close together. One well would serve several families. One 4-holer would serve 2 families with a partition in between. I said they didn't have any privacy even in the privy. I remember somebody saying that Ann Teeters was heard moaning and groaning, and then she said, I could have done that at the house. That's how private they were. It was like an extended family. I don't know any other way to put it. And the children played together. They went to visit the homes of their, and if I was in somebody's home and I misbehaved, the mama spanked me. That was the way it was. They didn't have to have babysitters, had a lot of babysitters. And Grandpa Phillips, I remember, lived about the middle of the village. And he surveyed, and he was Lord of all that he saw. And he sometimes gathered children to tell stories and sometimes to mediate fights, because there were plenty of fights among those. But for the most part, we got along fine together. I remember in the summertime, a game that was played, all the children in the village gathered at the end of the street, and several were selected as bears who hid out. And then the rest of us would run along and say, there ain't no bears out tonight, there ain't no bears out tonight. And the bear might come and get us. That was just one of the things. Another thing, in the wintertime, we went to Uncle Ivy Hickman's pasture when it snowed, to use our sleds. Several people would take wood, some would take food, and we'd stay all day sliding without good sleds, but it was an example of together. And Mrs. Sanford, Julie we called her, made cookies every week, and you could smell those things all over. And so the children would congregate at Julie's house. We thought she was one of us because she went barefoot in the summer just the way we did. But her cookies were so good, she saw that every child got 2. One chocolate covered and one plain one. I asked her daughter, Stella Carroll, once if she had her mother's recipe for cookies. They were so good. And Stella said, no, she just cooked. I think that expresses what a lot of our mothers were. They just cooked. I'm trying to think of Teresa Sherrill should be here to tell this, but some of the people coming in to the village, every Friday maybe, or Thursday, the people from the stores would come and take orders. Then the next day they would deliver the orders. And of course that was quite exciting, especially when Teresa, at age 9, began driving the delivery truck of her father. And when it appeared on the cotton mill village, all the little boys ran after it. They not only wanted to get on it, they wanted to drive. And Teresa says that she wore out more than 1 yardstick beating the boys off that truck. I wish you could hear Teresa tell about that. And another truck we enjoyed was the ice truck. The ice was cut certain sizes in Lenore, and then they were delivered, and the men would often chip off some ice for the children to have. And then Barbara helped me remember this. There was a black man who, and I think he always had a horse and wagon instead of a vehicle, automotive vehicle. He was the rag man. And I don't remember that we sang this, but this remains in my memory. Any rags, any bones, any bottles today? There's a big black rag man coming this way. And Barbara helped me remember that his name was Ed Hayes. I won't go into any more of this except to say that in times of illness, it was very important that because we did not have a doctor at all at that time. That came later. Eric can tell you about that, I think. But the mothers helped with each other. Thad Mullis told me one time that he would never forget my mother because when they had the flu epidemic of 1918, he said my mother literally moved into their house to take care of them, leaving me, age 9, to take care of our family.
This is Barbara Crump, and she's going to tell us her memories of Hudson.
I was born on the cotton mill houses, 1916, and my parents came, as Eunice said, from up in the mountains. The Reverend Jim Phillips and his family. And my mother, in 1914, married Ransom Barber. He didn't get to live but 2 years till he died with a ruptured appendix. And then 5 years later, she married Jim Harris. So we was all raised there on the cotton mill hill. And I remember the town, the stores that was here back then, whenever the Hermans had a store, Mullis's, and Frank Smith had a bicycle shop. There was a music store, the Hickman stores, the Thronberg store, and all those. And I remember one time whenever me and my cousin, I was about 13, we was coming back from Paul Pugh's store, and I heard a racket down back of the store. There was a jail called Calaboose. And about that time, Billy Cluniger was the chief of police, and he put one of the young men in jail for public drunk. And whenever we heard the racket, we looked, and he had some way and somehow made a hole on the roof and was climbing out. And he was stood up and hollered and hooped and jumped down and left. And that's I remember about the Calaboose. Then I remember the schools that I went to. The first one I went to was the one that had the auditorium upstairs. And one time when I went through the 3rd grade in that one. And one time when we was having chapel, Frank Herman, he rode a horse and rode it all the way up the stairs and down the auditorium. He had supposed to be in school, but he had got into his daddy's wine, and he was pretty well lit. I remember that. And then the other schools I remember going to, and then whenever I was married and we had the first lunchroom at Hudson School, Miss Tweed and Mother Crump and myself opened the first lunchroom. I had 5 children at that time. Joe was 5 years old, the baby one, and they said that they couldn't teach him, but they put him in the 1st grade with Jerry. And there was Joe and Jerry and Dean and Carol and John. John was 5. So I had to walk me and the 5 children every morning to the lunchroom. And sometimes it would be so cold and rainy. and they'd be crying, and I'd feel like it, but I didn't. So then I worked there, and then whenever Wesley was born, I stayed at home till he was 6, and I went back to school. And I went down to the middle school, Saliston, that I worked at as maid. So that's, I can remember back though when I was growing up about she was talking about the roads of being dirt. And I can remember when they drove cattle from the mountains down through here on those dirt roads. And the children from on the Continental Hill would run out and watch the cattle go down. So that's about all I can remember of Hudson, except the Ku Klux Klan. I remember that. They burned a cross on the last house on the Continental Hill down below where I was living in. I was about 9 years old when that happened. And this man was so mean to his wife. But the one good thing about Mr. Hayes, he kept a decent place on the Continental Hill. And if anything went kind of wrong, he would always get rid of the family. And we just had one big happy family on the Continental Hill where I grew up.
Thank you, Barbara. Next we have Johnson Coffey, who is a Hudson native and has some fond memories of growing up here.
Well, I was the 9th child born in the family of 10 children, to Bynum and Abby Coffey. And I was born in one of the cotton mill houses in which my family lived until I was about 3 years old. And we moved from the mill village into a house that my dad bought that is now known as Legion Road. And that is where I have lived all my life. And I went to Hudson schools, and moving into that house, there were no children around to play with much, but the Craig family out the road from me. And so on evenings when I wanted to go play, I would go play with Bright Craig, and we would make sand houses on the side of the road, which now you can't believe it, there's ever a bit of sand there. And I went to, I always took part in the church work, and then in the schools I was put in plays, and I really didn't. My father was elected mayor of Hudson when I was in about the 4th or 5th grade. I don't remember the exact year. And I finished, went on and went into high school and graduated from high school at the Hudson High School. And then I stayed at home after that until I was 33 years old because my mother had rheumatoid arthritis, and I stayed at home and did the housework. And after she passed away, I went to work, and that's my life.
And Blanche Fox is going to tell us some of her memories.
I was born in 1923 in Hudson on the old cotton mill Hill Village. And I lived there until I was 2 years old when my dad bought some property in Hudson, which we call the farm. Today it would look like a couple of lots, but to us it was a big, big place. My father was born and reared in Ashe County, and when he was a young man, because of being a part of a big family, my grandfather had 17 children. His first wife was the mother of 7, and the last wife, my grandmother, was the mother of 10. My father was the oldest of that family, the oldest son. times got very hard in the mountains, and so he was sent to Gastonia to find work. He began to work in a textile plant there, and he met my mother, who was working in a mill there. They married and came back immediately to Hudson. My dad worked in the mill along with Eunice's father. He was the other overseer in the mill for many, many years. I remember so well during a time when things were very, very hard in Hudson and many people were out of work, that my dad had work as a night watchman at the mill. And when he would get ready to leave home after supper to go to work, I would catch a fit. I wanted to go with him. I could not stand to be parted from my daddy. So many times he took me with him, and I slept on the big piles of cotton in the mill. Then he would wake me up when he had to make rounds, and I can remember so well, even in cold weather, going with him out to the big barns where he had to check in ever so often. I was very close to my father because I was the only girl in a family of 5 brothers. I was born and delivered by Harry Hickman's father, and he told when I was born that I was the first white child he had delivered in Hudson. And what he meant by that was, he said that I was never red like most babies. So he had a part in naming me. And of course my name is French for white. And so I've always been very proud of that fact. I have a lot of memories about school. I started in the 1st grade, and my teacher was Miss Estoy Hayes. She was Miss Estoy Bragg at that time. And she told us that first year that she was going to teach as long as we were in school. And that's exactly what she did. She taught until we graduated from the 11th grade. I have very, very wonderful memories of her. She has some things that she tells about me too, and maybe that's best left unsaid. But I remember in high school especially, Miss Margie Barringer was the head of our dramatics department. And when I was still in 8th grade, she came one day and asked me to come and try out for a part in a play that was going to be given. I did. I got the part, and I stayed with her for 4 years in dramatics and went on to Lenore Ryan College and took dramatics there too. I taught school for 38 years and loved it very, very much. I was able to teach kindergarten through 8th grade, not all at the same time, but I had a lot of experiences with different ages of children. My church has always been very, very important to me. I remember the 3 churches that are grouped together in Hudson, the Methodists and the Baptists and the Lutheran. And when I was in high school, the Lutheran church had a total of 35 members. And they did not have enough people to put on any sort of a program at Christmas or Easter or anything. And so they used our drama club from Hudson School. And it was always a privilege, I think, to have a part in that church. We got to know a lot of the people, and a lot of my friends belonged to those churches too. I was especially close to Louise Thronberg, who also taught school for about the same length of time that I did, and the Hickman twins, Christine and Kathleen, were my very closest friends. They were so identical that not many people could tell them apart. But they went home with me every day at lunchtime because they carried their lunch, and I went home because I was close enough. And so Mama would always have some kind of a dessert for them, and she made her a little plan where she would, when they would come in, she would say, "Now, are you Christine? Are you Kathleen?" And whichever one she decided on, she'd put a big safety pin on their dress. And we'd go in the other room and switch the safety pin every day. But I don't think Mama called on, and it didn't really make that much difference. But the town itself was special to me, and as these other ladies have said, I remember a lot of the stores very well, and especially do I remember Fox's Barber Shop. We called Mr. Fox Daddy Fox all the years, and he had several sons who were all barbers. His youngest son, Earl, was the one who always cut my hair, and I cried every time because Mama would shampoo my hair, send me to the barber shop, Earl would cut it, and then it would be a good half-inch shorter when it got dry. We never could make them understand that it didn't need to be that wet or that short. But I grew up, and not only did I marry a fox, but I married a barber. So it's been quite a life. Now, Nell mentioned about my gardening. I love beautiful flowers and I love gardening, but most of the credit goes to my husband. He is an avid gardener. He loves his yard, and he spends so much of his time. We have 2 children. Our son Charles is with the North Carolina Baptist Foundation. He has the whole central part of North Carolina as his territory, and he is very, very happy in his job. Our daughter Suzanne followed in her mama's footsteps, and she's a school teacher. We have 4 grandchildren, and now 2 great-grandchildren who are prizes. Someone has mentioned about Mr. Ed Hayes. As far as I can remember, he's the first black person I ever saw. And of course in Hudson, you didn't see many black people. But when he would come to our house, he was always so gracious, and we would usually have some sort of rags or something that he could take. And that was interesting to me. And another thing was the Iceman, because when he came in the summer, he would always chip off the ice so that all of us could have a few pieces, and that was special. I can remember that when we first moved to the farm, we had a spring where Mom kept the milk and butter and so forth, and it was through the cow pasture. And I was afraid of cows, so I would never go to the spring. And sometimes I was the one there that needed to go. So Daddy had an ice box built, and it was lined with tin. I can see it to this day. And so the Iceman came a couple times a week, and he got ice. And then one day my mama goes out to get something out of the ice box, and she sees a little line of ants going along. So the next day we had our first Kelvinator refrigerator. It was so little, as I remember it now, but to me then it was a huge thing, and the children around us would slip in and open the door to see if the light would be on or off, you know. But I had a good childhood. I had kin folks living all around me, because after Daddy bought our place, 2 of his brothers immediately bought houses close by. And so all the children were together and really reared together. And Eunice mentioned about wherever she happened to be, if she misbehaved, she got a spanking. We've laughed a lot about the fact that my mother did not work, so she was the stay-at-home mom. My 2 aunts worked, so Mama actually reared 3 families of children, and it didn't bother her a bit to get the switch if one of us needed it. It was a good life, and it was a very safe life to us. We never had a lock on the door. Didn't know what it was to lock a door. We were in and out of homes that nobody locked the door. And it was just wonderful to live as a child in a place where you felt that safe.
Very good.
There's a lot I could say.
Before we go on to Gordon Bush, I want to stop for just a moment and thank our videographer, Dick Jones. He's filming this for us this afternoon, and I'm sure it's something that's going to live a long time after Dick and I are gone. I might just say too that he and I are the newcomers in Hudson. I've only lived here 33 years, and Dick, you've lived here, what, about 4 years, 3 years? But we love Hudson just like you folks do. Now we're going to hear from Gordon Bush.
First, I want to say it's nice of Eunice and to have us all here to bring some memories from a long time back. I was born at what is now the White Oak Place on the, in 1914. My first memory is of the flu in 1918. We all had the flu. Most of the families around had the flu at that time. And I was the first one up. We was all bedfast, and I was the first one up at 4 years old, and I carried the bedpans out, I remember. After that, my daddy sold the farm that we were living at then, and we moved to Illinois and stayed there 5 or 6 years, and moved back to Lenore, where I went to school for a year and something, and moved back to my grandfather's place, which is now the Marshall home on Friendly Park Road. I walked from there to school from then till I graduated from high school in 1931 at Hudson. And then there was no buses that run on the road, and there was no paved roads at that time. We walked in the mud, and times were really hard during the 29, 30, 30s, in the early 30s. We had one pair of shoes. I remember I had one pair of shoes, and my daddy would half sole them shoes one time, and they had to do you the year. And I, many times before I'd get home, I'd pull my shoes off up in March and go barefooted the rest of the way home. Hudson at that time, I remember the Hudson as it was at that time, right where the drugstore is now. Jim Clore run he had the blacksmith shop there, and he would cut off the ends of the horseshoeing when he would horseshoe, and all of the kids of us that had a slingshot, we would be there to get the ends of those so we could have those to shoot on the slingshot. They were deadly for birds if you could hit one. And anyhow, the lineup at Hudson then, it started with, as already been indicated, with the mill, and then the Hayeses, and then the Thornburgs, and then it went on to Zeb Johnson had a building that later the Beaches bought for a 5 and 10 cent store, and then Paul Pugh had his store, and next then was the filling station that Garland Conley run. First, Schufer Coffee and Eichert, Sid Eichert run the filling station. And during the time that I was in my last year of high school, and I had my lunch there. And I remember distinctly that the price of things, my folks, I'd always carried a poke with old ham biscuits to school, and would always trade it for a peanut butter sandwich, a ham biscuit any time. But anyhow, a hamburger was a nickel, a hot dog was a nickel, liver mush was a nickel, and a moon pie a nickel, and a big knee-high drink was a nickel. I ate my lunch all through my last year at high school in 1931 for 15 cents a day. I don't know how my parents was able to furnish that much money for me to eat with, but anyhow they did instead of having to carry the lunch. But A.D. Huffine was the principal during that time, and he was right much of a disciplinarian, and he whooped me and Hugh Scrump pretty often. Hughes and I were great buddies. We run around together from high school days, but A.D. always seen that we behaved ourselves very well. Speaking of, it's already been spoken about, but the roads at that time, before that time, there was a dirt road to Lenore, and many times I'd managed to get a dime and I'd walk to Lenore and see the picture show for 9 cents. And I'd always see it 2 or 3 times and then get back home at night, have to walk up there and back. Very seldom did you ever get a ride at that time. This even last Sunday, as I was coming to church and had to stop right at the mill before I could get to the church, I waited ever so long before the light changed, and I told Carrie, my wife, I said, I never thought that I'd live to see the day that there'd be this much traffic in Hudson. We used to skate when they finally got a cement road up through Hudson. We'd get a crowd of skating, young people, and somebody that had a T-model Ford or A model would pull us up and down through the main drag of Hudson, and for hours at a time, 2 or 3 hours at a time, there wouldn't be a car come through Hudson. Times were, as I got back to, times were really hard back at that time. I remember, I want to put something in about politics, whether it is appropriate or not, but anyhow, the Hickmans run the store across the railroad, the Thornburgs run the store on the other side. Every time there's a change of administration, the post office would change. And I went to Hickman's when the Republicans would be in power, to the post office, and when the Democrats would be in power, it'd be at the Thornburg store. And finally, then it moved down. Paul Pugh and Grace Pugh had the post office, and she kept it from the rest of the time for a good many years. Hudson has a lot of memories for me. A lot of them that I can't say at this time that happened in Hudson, but Hudson was a good place. Has been indicated a good place to grow up in, and I've always have fond memories of my younger days at Hudson. I believe that's about all that I could add right at this time.
Very good.
This is Dr. Harry Hickman, who was also born and grew up in Hudson, and he's going to fill us in on some of his memories today.
I was born in 1913 in my grandfather's house, which is on the east side of the highway, and across the highway from the railroad. My grandfather moved here in about 1888, before it was a town. I think he bought property from the Hudson family, Johnny Hudson. At that time, when I was a young child, we lived on the east side of what was called the Old Road between Granite Falls and Lenore. That later became Highway 321 and was paved about 1926. In those early days, the Highway 321 came through the middle of sawmills, across Gunpowder Creek, and came up the west side of the railroad, right in front of Eunice's house here. And none of the roads were paved. There was quite much wagon traffic on the old road that we lived on. It passed by our log house. The log house was destroyed in 1918 when the new house was completed. We had 3 big oak trees in the front yard, formed a triangle, and in the middle of that triangle there was a deep well, and every wagon or buggy that passed by would stop there and get water to drink. And the dipper stayed out there in a bucket, and everybody used it. Later on, of course, the highway was changed again, became the road that passed right in front of our house became paved in about 1926. The school I attended, of course, was the old two-story brick building with a narrow door in front and back. And the auditorium was on the second floor. I remember when I was in the 4th grade that my home room was at the end of the stage on the second floor. Traffic increased gradually through the years, so that by the time 321 was paved, traffic was much more frequent, even though that was Depression time. In 1933, after I'd gotten my AB degree from Duke University, my father died in September. I had no money to go back to medical school. So Garland Conley and I bought into the filling station and ran it along with a little cafe. We had slot machines, 5 cents. We had hot dogs for a nickel. We had hamburgers for a nickel. We had trouble with cockroaches in that place. One morning it was my duty to open up the stations at 5 o'clock. So the people who were on their way to the mill who were about out of gas could stop and buy a gallon of gasoline for 20 cents and go on. One night the temperature got to 2 degrees below zero, and when I opened up, built a fire in the stove, I found out that all the soft drinks stacked in there were frozen, except ones in the drink box, which were not frozen. After that day, we never had another cockroach. They were frozen out. Now my dad went to Richmond, Virginia and studied medicine. And he graduated in 1909 and came home. He started practice in a buggy or horseback in the midst of a typhoid epidemic. After he was married in 1911, I think he started making his calls mainly in a buggy. And then along about 1917, 1918, he got his first car. It was a car that had an acetylene tank on the running board to furnish the headlights. And the headlights, of course, had to be lit with a match. He didn't have that car very long. He got one that got a battery system then later on. But he often, in his early days, would go on a phone call, and we may not see him for a day or two, because there were enough phones scattered over the county. We had one, the drugstore had one, there was one in Johnson family over in what we called Antioch, had a First man in Sawmills had a telephone. Somebody up in Whitnall had one. So that when he was on a home call, he would usually go to the nearest phone when he got through that home call, and he'd call Mother to find out if he had any more calls. And in the flu epidemic, it might be 3 days before we'd see him, because he would go from one place to another and keep on. He'd eat wherever he was and nap wherever he was. One time, Mother woke me up just after I'd gone to sleep one night. She said, "Once you get up and go home, I'm going to call with your dad. He's been going all the time, and I'm afraid he'd go to sleep and have a wreck." So I dressed and got in the car with him, and we went over near Sawmills. He got out of the car and went in the house, and before he went in the house, he said, "I'll probably be back in about 20, 30 minutes. He came back in about 15 minutes. He said, "Son, this is going to take longer than I expected. It's a labor case." So I sat in that car in the dark. I don't know how long, but eventually he came back. It must have been 2 or 3 hours. And then one morning, they woke me up early. And said, "Get down here and go with your dad. His car broke down." So came down, and Dad says, "I'm going to take the family car, and I want you to ride this mule back to where my car is broke down." He says, "I'll follow you." Well, I had never had ridden a mule. I rode it that morning. It seemed like it was going to take us all day to get to that place, and it was down below Sawmills. It was probably 2.5 miles from home. Later on, of course, as cars got better, practice of medicine also became more easily available. My father was a large man. He weighed about 270 pounds. And he developed a peritonitis, apparently due to a ruptured appendix, which was almost without any symptoms. He told me that he had a catch in his side Saturday evening in his office, and he thought it was a little muscular rheumatism. And he went to visit relatives over in Rutherford on Sunday, and he ate 2 big meals, and I drove back home. And when we got back to the house, he said, "My side's bothering me a little bit. I had a catch in there yesterday at the office. It had bothered him all day." I said, "Just stay in the car and go to the hospital and see Dr. Rivers." He did. The rest of the family got out. I drove him up there. Dr. Russell checked him, checked the blood count, and he says, "I believe you might have an early appendix. I think we better take a look at it." And when the operation was over, Dr. Russell said that when they opened the peritoneal cavity, the pus under pressure just shot out of his abdomen. And then he died at 9 o'clock the next morning. And that was a weird thing, because he had always insisted on early treatment for the appendicitis, and yet it got him.
Harry, why don't you tell us about your first patient? Do you recall your first patient and how much that patient paid you?
I can tell you that my father's income back during the Depression was about $4,000 a year in the late 20s, early 30s, Depression time. Which was really a pretty big income back in those days compared to other incomes. Some of the people in the mill were making $15 a week. I don't remember my first patient.
Do you remember how many babies you brought into the world?
I did home deliveries for a year when I first started practice. So I started practice in 1938. I'm sorry, in 1940. I graduated from medical school in 1938 and started practicing in the Noradilla Hospital in July the 1st, 1940. And I got busy right from the very beginning because when I reported to the hospital in July the 2nd to go to work, Dr. Doolittle says, I'm going to Chicago to a medical convention. Here, take this, see this patient, make that phone call, that sort of thing. So I started working then just like I did when I was an intern. And so that there wasn't any starting out and gradually building up. I started out full force. And I did home deliveries for about a year. But Dr. Troutman was the other doctor in our group at the hospital. And he enjoyed doing the deliveries and so on and so forth. So after a year, I turned all my obstetrical patients over to him, and I started doing mainly children. But I saw a lot of adults too, up until the 2 years I was in practice before I went into the Air Force.
And your last practice was out at the old home place, wasn't it?
That's right.
Right on South of Main Street.
Right. But actually I was connected with the Caldwell Hospital all the time. Metropolitan Hospital closed in about 1963 or 4, I guess it was. No. About 1970, I guess it was. And I moved to Kent House down on the hospital property. And then when they needed that area or expansion of offices and so forth, then I moved to Hudson. But I was associated with the hospital all the time.
Well, I want to thank all of you for sharing these wonderful memories with us. And I know there must be something that you have forgotten somewhere along the way when you were talking. If there's something else you'd like to have on tape right now, just raise your hand and Dick will pan in on you. And okay.
One of the things I remember so well from my childhood was every summer, all the children in town were gathered together and we were given shots in front of the old Hudson drugstore. And one of the things that was so enticing to us was the fact that as soon as we got the shot for diphtheria, whooping cough, typhoid, whatever all the shots were, we got to go into the drugstore and have a cone of ice cream. One particular day, as I went into the drugstore, my father had gone in just before me and was standing kind of back from the counter. And when I asked for my ice cream, Mr. John Hickman fixed my cone of ice cream, and then he took a big bite out of it. And he started to hand it to me, and my dad walked up and said, "That's your ice cream. Now fix her some."
Let me. May I add something in connection with what Harry has just been talking about? He and Garland Conley were at the filling station, and like they said, they had a slot machine in the back. Well, after I finished high school, I played baseball that summer with in the Western North Carolina League, and that winter I got a job. They gave me a job at Coffee Shop, 10 hours a day and 5 hours on Saturday, 55 hours a week, and $8.55. I paid $1 a week to Clarence McGee to ride back to work and back. I come to Hudson, and with that $7.55, and went in Harry and Garland's back where they had the slot machine, and rolled every nickel of that $7.55 in that slot machine that Harry was talking about.
Thank you.
That taught me a lesson, and from then on, if I ever run on a slot machine, I'd put a quarter in it, and if I didn't win anything, I just kept it going. Another thing that I'd like to add, that during the time that I was in Hudson, and when I was 12 years old or 13, I joined the Hudson Methodist Church when the old building was there. And Lois Hass now was playing the piano on the old upright piano. Her mother was a regular piano player, but Lois' feet wouldn't hardly touch the pedals, and her mama had her playing the piano in that old church. There wasn't too many there. All they had was a stove on each side with a pipe running all the way across the top, and Thomas Hickman furnished the wood, I think, to fire the stoves during that time. But I'd just like to add that I did join the church when I was 12 years old, and I like to say too that I got away from it. Growing up in Hudson, I got away from the Lord for a good many years, but praise the Lord, I got back to it about 16 years ago, and we've been trying, my wife and I, to live it ever since.
This need not be recorded, but it's in line with what he was saying about the slot machine and so forth. One night, maybe an hour after dark, a man drove into a filling station with his car and parked near the gas hose. Back then, we pumped the gas up into a cylinder and then let it drain out by gravity through the hose. And we sold gasoline for 20 cents a gallon. We made 2 cents on every gallon of gasoline we sold. And another 2 cents went to pay rent for the station. That's the way we paid our rent. So this car drove in, and I went out and said, "Can I help you, sir?" And the man said, "My name is A.B. Goodman." Now, A.B. Goodman was the son of old Dr. Goodman in Lenore. "My name is A.B. Goodman, and I have been on the road from Atlanta, and I'm about out of gasoline. I live in Lenore." He says, "I'm about out of gasoline and I don't have any money. What you gonna do about it?" So I thought a 2 seconds and I said, "Well, I'll give him a gallon of gasoline." He departed. I never heard from him again.
Typical.
If you've got folks, I'd just like to say that the memory that I have, that is, I'm sure, my own, not an absorbed memory, was of coming home from spending the night with a neighbor to find a red, squalling baby in my mother's arms, and I hated her for a long time. But this was the sure sign there was a new baby, that the children had to spend the night somewhere else. There were no hospitals, doctors did not have offices, and so on. Some of my other vivid early memories were of World War I. In school, we knitted washcloths for the soldiers. We were encouraged to save our nickels and dimes and buy war bonds. I think they were called Liberty bonds. And I wish I still had some of those. They wouldn't be worth too much, but it'd be nice to have. And I remember Barbara talked about how gracious Mr. Hayes was and how understanding. Also, I could say Mrs. Hayes. Ms. Hayes used to have parties for the children in town, and she invited us cotton mill trash along with the other children. And as Bain Hickman says, some of the delicacies that we learned to like to eat were first served at Mrs. Hayes' parties. And I'm sure good manners came off from her to us too. Besides, she was a lovely lady, dressed well. And Mr. Hayes had the only radio in town. And he would, from time to time, invite people to come into his home to hear a radio program. I remember he invited Papa and Hunt and me, along with a number of other people, to listen to President Wilson address the nation. And the radios were this kind, so what we did, we listened maybe for a sentence or two and passed it on. Nobody got to hear very much of the speech, but it was a wonderful thing to be able to say, I have heard the President of the United States make a speech. And then for a long time I couldn't find anybody who remembered Armistice Day and what we did in Hudson. But I remember Armistice Day very well. Of course, the war we felt was right. It was the war that was going to end all wars, and we believed that thoroughly. And Papa got his Dear John letter, and I remember my mother cried. That's the only time I had ever seen her cry. But he didn't have to go because the armistice came. On the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, the war ceased. And in Hudson, the cotton mill whistles blew, the church bells rang, and people who were even reserved rushed into the street, crying, laughing, and I don't know whether they danced or not. Maybe they were Baptists and they didn't dance. But, and I remember also the flu epidemic. Barton Hayes says there was a smallpox epidemic about the same time, but I don't remember anything about that. So I'll get off my horse now.
One thing, the telegraph was the way that news got around back in those days. And I remember the day that the World War I ended, our telephone rang. About the time we were just getting up in the morning. My dad hadn't even gotten his clothes on yet. The telephone rang. And he went to the phone and said, talked a little bit. He hung up and he turned around and he said, well, the war's over. The station agent had gotten that message from the telegraph. And I called the drugstore, and then Uncle John had called Dad. During the World Series, back in those days, well, they kept up with the scores in the World Series by the telegraph. You go to the drugstore and maybe out to the depot and get it firsthand.
Do any of you remember the first little depot that was at Hudson? I do. Tell us about it, Barbara.
I can remember going down there when I was 8 years old, and me and my grandmother was going to Mortimer on the train. That's the first train ride I ever took to see her daughter, Allie, and sitting there listening to the click, click, clack of that thing that was going on. I can remember that real good, and I know Houston was telling this tale one time about whenever, Gordon might have been on that, I don't know. But anyway, him and some of the boys, the man that lived right across from the depot had a wagon, and that night they went over there and got that man's wagon and took it apart and put it on top of the depot and put it back together. I can remember Houston telling me that.
Gordon, were you involved in that?
I remember a lot. I remember the depot. The depot when we moved to Illinois when I was 5 years old. We took our belongings that we had and rode from a wagon on a wagon over to this depot and with our processions that we carried with us to Illinois and got on the train there and come back on the train to Hudson and Lenore from Illinois in 1926. I remember on this particular trip we had a sale over at for a home and farm at that time, and I had a dog named Sharp. And Papa was going to sell my dog, and I cried so hard that he made a crate and hauled that dog over to Hudson and put it on that depot and shipped it to Illinois. And when we come back to North Carolina, we brought my dog Sharp back in the same crate. And so I had something in common with the depot, that first depot at Hudson.
Anybody else? Well, I know we can sit here and talk all afternoon. This is going to be a more than an hour video as it is now. But I think you all ought to give yourself a big hand while we thank Dick for doing this.
My pleasure.
And I want to thank y'all again for coming. We'll let you know when we get this ready because
Nice to see you.
it's going to be something that we'll
Johnson,
treasure.
see you.
Bring your wife and come down.
She's been under the weather.
Please support our Caldwell Heritage Museum, 112 Vaden Street, Lenore, North Carolina, 28645, and please visit my Facebook page, Lenore and Caldwell County History, on Facebook.